Very scary winter horror stories. The wind howled through the empty streets of Harrow's End, a quiet village nestled in the mountains. It was the kind of wind that you could almost feel in your bones, biting and relentless. The world outside was consumed by snow, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on everything, making everything feel small, insignificant. Silence. An unbearable silence, broken only by the eerie wail of the wind. Lillian had come here seeking peace. After months of chaos, her life unraveling, her mind in pieces, she needed this. A remote cabin in a remote village. It was supposed to be her fresh start. The isolation should have been comforting. But lately, it felt wrong. The snow kept falling. Day after day it piled higher, burying the trees, covering the roads, erasing the outside world. It seemed peaceful at first, like a serene white wonderland. But now, it felt like the snow was watching her, smothering her every move. And then, there were the sounds. The faint scraping sounds that started only at night. She tried to ignore them at first, thought it was just the wind or the trees. It had to be. But as the days went by, those sounds grew more deliberate, more like something or someone was trying to get in. But she was here alone, wasn't she? It was late that night. The storm outside had intensified. The wind wasn't just a gust now. It was a howling beast rattling the walls of her cabin. Lillian pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to chase away the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. She glanced at the window, but the snow had turned the world outside into a swirling white void. That's when she heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, almost like a breath against the door. Number. It wasn't possible. Who would be out there in this storm? She couldn't remember seeing anyone when she arrived. A second knock, louder this time. Louder. Her heart skipped a beat. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed deeper. The knocking wasn't coming from the wind. The wind didn't knock. Lillian's breath caught in her throat as she stood up, her hands trembling. She walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. What if it was someone from the village? A traveler, maybe, caught in the storm. Or was it? The door. The door. Her fingers grazed the handle and she froze for a moment. There was a knot in her stomach, tight, pulling, unwilling to let go. The knock had stopped. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating. She could hear the fire crackling in the corner, but everything else was too still. Too still. She turned the handle, the door creaking open slowly. She squinted into the blinding white of the storm. Nothing. There was nothing outside but swirling snow, an endless vacant field of whiteness. Her breath fogged up the air in front of her, and she stepped outside, cautiously looking around, expecting to see someone. But there was no one. There were no footprints. Nothing. The cold bit at her, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the empty, desolate landscape. It felt like the storm was watching her, waiting. She backed inside quickly, locking the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, trying to calm her ragged breathing. That feeling, the one that had been gnawing at her since she arrived, was back. She couldn't shake it off. What was it? What was happening? The fire continued to crackle, its warmth fading against the growing cold. Lillian wrapped herself in her blanket, but it didn't help. Her mind raced. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside seemed like it was part of the same terrifying noise. And then, again, the scraping. The faintest sound, just beyond the walls. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate. It wasn't the snow against the cabin. It was something else. Her heartbeat quickened, each thudding pulse in her chest louder than the next. Her breath came in short gasps and her legs shook as she stood up again. She couldn't just stay there waiting. She had to know. With each step, the air around her seemed to grow colder. The house felt more like a prison. She hesitated for a moment, standing in the living room, her eyes darting toward the walls. The sound was coming from the walls. It was faint, like fingernails scraping against the inside of the wood. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Her skin prickled as though someone was standing right behind her. Someone watching. She slowly moved toward the hallway, toward the sound, the bedroom door. It was open. Lillian's chest tightened as she stared at the slightly ajar door. She hadn't opened it. She was sure of it. She always closed it, always locked it. The footsteps, the scraping, they were coming from that room. She took a slow step forward, her body trembling. The room was dark, too dark. Her heart hammered in her chest as she moved closer, her feet barely touching the floor, like she didn't want to disturb the air around her. The door was wide open now. Inside the room was nothing but darkness, but there, at the center of the room, was a single footprint, a wet footprint. It was fresh, too fresh. Lillian stepped back, her breath quick and shallow. How? How did it get there? The snow. Outside, there was so much snow. No one could have come in without leaving tracks. No one had come. No one. A cold chill ran down her spine, and then, softly, barely audible, a whisper. Lillian's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The whisper was too close now. You shouldn't have come here, Lillian. Her blood ran cold. The room spun. The whispers. They were coming from behind her, from inside the walls. Her skin was ice, her body frozen in place. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. Her legs didn't move. The only sound in the room was her own panicked breathing, the sharp inhale as she spun around. But there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. And that whisper. Still there, lingering in the shadows. Her throat tightened as she took one last look at the room. The door had closed, behind her. And for the first time, Lillian realized she had never been alone. Not once. And now the storm had found her. This is the creepy winter horror story number 2. The snowstorm hit just after dusk, blanketing everything in thick white layers. Heather had barely noticed the time as she trudged home through the swirling snow, her feet sinking deeper into the cold, unrelenting ground. The storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the world around her. Every gust of wind felt like an icy slap against her skin. Her mind, already heavy from a long day of work, struggled to focus as she made her way toward her cottage. The wind howled, biting into her bones, making her want to hurry. But the storm was relentless. The closer she got to her house, the more isolated the world seemed, the more it felt like she was drifting away from everything she knew. When she finally reached her house, the familiar warmth from the fireplace beckoned. Her small cottage was tucked at the edge of the woods. Quiet, peaceful. Or at least, it had been, until recently. Recently, things had begun to feel different here. Strange. And tonight, with the storm howling outside and everything so quiet, it felt wrong. The door creaked open, and the warmth of the fire rushed to meet her. But instead of the comfort she longed for, there was only an oppressive silence. No sound, not even the soft click of her cat's paws across the floor. She shook her head. It was just the storm, messing with her mind. She closed the door behind her, the lock clicking into place, and the wind's howl grew muffled. But as the storm continued its assault against the windows, something inside her grew cold. She set her bag down on the table, her feet dragging across the floor as she removed her boots. The quiet was unnerving. In a house that was usually filled with the soft creaks and groans of settling wood, tonight it was entirely still. Something wasn't right. She had lived here for months now, and she should have been used to it by now. The silence, the solitude. But lately, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her. The thought had crossed her mind before, but she had always pushed it aside as absurd. After all, how could a house watch you? But tonight, it felt different. "Hello?" she called out softly. half expecting her cat to emerge from wherever she was hiding. There was nothing. She waited, straining her ears for any sound, maybe a soft meow, a rustle. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Her pulse quickened, but she dismissed it. It was just the storm, the wind playing tricks on her. She moved into the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She flicked on the kettle, watching the steam rise as the water began to heat. It was then that she noticed something. The kitchen was unnervingly still. There was no hum of the fridge, no distant rumble of the house's old pipes. The silence was oppressive. Heather froze. Was that a creak? She turned toward the hallway. Nothing. But her heart was racing now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the kettle, her eyes darting back toward the hallway. She told herself it was nothing. The house settling. But then, the floorboards creaked again. It was unmistakable. Slowly, Heather's gaze shifted toward the living room where the shadows stretched long and dark. She stood there, unmoving, listening. A soft shuffle. It was coming from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew the house well. There was no one else here. No one could be here. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her chest. She had to move. She had to know what was making that noise. But as she took a step toward the hallway, something stopped her. It was the distinct sound of something being dragged. Her heart hammered in her chest as her feet froze to the floor. What the hell? Who was in her house? The noise was slow, deliberate. The sound of something scraping against the wooden floor just beyond her line of sight. A cold, paralyzing wave of fear rushed over her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a weak, trembling sound. She didn't know if she was speaking to the house, or to whatever was lurking in the shadows. The shuffle stopped. Silence. Then, another creak. Her legs felt like lead. She could hardly move, but she had to know. She had to see. With every step toward the hallway, her heart seemed to beat louder in her chest, as though it was trying to escape. She could feel the weight of every moment stretching in front of her. And then, from the corner of her eye, something moved. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light. Just a flicker, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. Her pulse spiked. She was no longer alone in the house. Her mouth went dry. The dark hallway before her seemed to stretch out endlessly, the shadows swallowing the little light from the fire. There was no sound now, no creaks, no whispers, just the silence, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. Heather wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. Her feet were glued to the floor, her body shaking. And then she heard it, the softest whisper, barely audible over the howling wind outside. "You shouldn't be here." Her stomach dropped. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But there was no making sense of this. No explanation, just the cold reality that something, someone, was in her house, in the dark with her. The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. "Leave. Now." Her breath hitched in her chest. She had to get out of here. She had to leave, but her body wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the growing dread that clawed at her insides. She turned toward the door, her legs shaking as she tried to move, but the house seemed to close in on her. The shadows in the hallway shifted. It was as if they were reaching for her. She felt the cold touch of fear running up her spine, her skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. And then, another knock. It was sudden, a loud, sharp knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered as she stumbled backward, staring at the door like it might burst open at any moment. Who was out there? Who would be out in this storm? The door creaked in the wind, almost inviting her to open it, but she couldn't. Her mind screamed at her to stay inside, but her body moved on its own accord. With shaking hands, she reached for the doorknob, her fingers icy with fear. She pulled it open just enough to peer outside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Nothing. Just snow. Nothing but endless snow. The same swirling mass of white that had surrounded her all evening. But she wasn't alone. She wasn't. The air grew colder, the silence louder. She could feel it. It was closing in on her, that thing. Whatever it was. Her heart raced as she slammed the door shut, bolting it behind her, and then in the stillness she heard it again. A whisper. Leave. This time it was closer. Closer than before. And then, everything went dark. This is the most creepy winter horror story number 3. It was a bitter December evening when Olivia found herself driving back into the small town where she grew up. The snow had begun to fall steadily, blurring the road ahead of her. The kind of snow that felt suffocating, smothering everything in a thick white veil. The streets were empty, and the houses with their dark windows looked like abandoned skeletons, watching her as she drove past. She had always sworn to herself that she would never return here, not after everything that had happened. But today, as her grandmother's birthday loomed closer, a strange pull had washed over her. She couldn't explain it, not fully, but something inside her told her she had to return. The town had changed. At least it felt different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, something Olivia couldn't quite put her finger on. The stores were closed, the streets eerily quiet, and the cold felt deeper somehow. Colder, more oppressive. Even the once cheerful town had turned into something unfamiliar, like a forgotten place in a dream. The house where her grandmother had lived was at the edge of town, barely visible through the dense snowfall. It had always been a strange place for Olivia, a home that felt both comforting and wrong. She had spent so many years trying to forget it, trying to forget the memories locked inside those walls, the things she couldn't understand back then. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her hands suddenly trembling, a cold sweat gathering on the back of her neck. But she pressed on, pushing past the fear that began creeping in. Her grandmother's house was closer now, just a few more miles. The cabin came into view, its silhouette barely discernible in the falling snow. The porch sagged beneath the weight of time. The roof slightly caved in at one corner. Nothing looked the way it used to. The house looked abandoned, as though it had been waiting for her to come back, as though it had been expecting her. Olivia parked the car in front of the house, the crunch of the tires against the snow cutting through the silence. She sat there for a moment staring at the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself was pulling her in, trapping her there. She could feel the pull of the past, of memories she wasn't ready to face. It was as if something was drawing her in, something powerful, something dark. But she couldn't stay in the car forever. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and stepped outside. The cold was biting, cutting through her coat and straight to her bones. She hurried up the stairs to the front door, her feet crunching in the thick snow beneath her. She raised her hand to knock, but then she stopped. The door was slightly open. Her heart skipped a beat. That wasn't right. "Grandma," she called out softly. But there was no answer. Olivia hesitated for a long moment before slowly pushing the door open, stepping inside the dark house. The air was stale, colder than it should have been. She shivered involuntarily, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. She could smell the faint scent of cedar wood, the smell of her grandmother's house. But there was something else, something off. She stepped further into the living room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The old rocking chair by the window was still there just like she remembered it, but something was wrong. The chair, it was moving. It was moving by itself. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She froze, unable to move, unable to think. The chair was rocking back and forth slowly, creaking with each motion, but no one was sitting in it. There was no one there. The room was empty. Her heart raced. She took a step back, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind, the house settling, anything. But no. There was something in the air, something heavy, like a presence that refused to be ignored. She could feel it all around her, pressing in on her from every corner of the room. "Grandma?" Her voice trembled. The word felt fragile in her mouth, like it might break apart if she said it too loudly. But there was no answer. She stepped cautiously toward the rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the empty space where her grandmother would always sit. The chair creaked louder now, the rocking faster. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of the chair. The wood felt cold. Too cold. Without thinking, she turned and hurried toward the stairs, her footsteps quickening as panic started to rise in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The house, it felt wrong, like it was holding her captive, like it didn't want her to leave. Then from upstairs came a noise so faint yet unmistakable. A door creaking open. Olivia froze in place. The sound echoed through the house, filling the air with an eerie vibration. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as her heart began to hammer in her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to leave, to drive away and never look back. But something deep inside her, kept her rooted to the spot. The sound of footsteps from above. Slow, deliberate. Each step felt like it was drawing closer, closer to her, even though she couldn't see anyone. The silence of the house amplified every noise, every movement, every breath. "Grandma?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper, desperate for some kind of answer, any answer, even if it was the wrong one. The footsteps stopped. And then, the door to her grandmother's bedroom slowly creaked open. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, rooted to the ground by an invisible force. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand to know what was happening, but her voice wouldn't come. She took a shaky step toward the stairs, her mind screaming for her to leave, but her feet didn't obey. They carried her up the stairs as if they had a mind of their own, drawn toward that door at the end of the hall. She reached the top of the stairs, the air thicker now, harder to breathe. The hallway stretched before her, empty, cold. The door to her grandmother's room was open just a crack. Her pulse raced. She didn't want to go any closer. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't turn back. She was already too far in. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open wider. The room was dark, the moonlight barely filtering through the window. The bed was empty, the covers twisted and thrown back as if someone had just gotten out. But that wasn't what caught her attention. No. What caught her attention was the rocking chair. It was moving. Faster now. Almost violently. The chair rocked back and forth, creaking loudly, the sound deafening in the silence. And then she saw it. A figure. It was her grandmother. Or it should have been. But the woman standing in the doorway wasn't her grandmother. Her grandmother's face was gaunt, her eyes wide and empty, hollow like she had been staring into the void for too long. Her body was hunched, her skin tight against her bones. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there staring at Olivia with those wide, empty eyes. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over her. Her mouth went dry and she couldn't breathe. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Olivia spun on her heels, her feet moving faster than she had ever run before, pounding down the stairs, her heart pounding louder with each step. She reached the front door, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the doorknob. But the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. She pulled harder, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. Her breathing was frantic now, sharp, ragged. Her mind was a blur, thoughts tumbling over one another. Finally, the door flew open. She stumbled outside, the cold air biting at her face, but she barely felt it. She ran. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her chest heaving, her heart pounding. the fear still clinging to her like a shadow. She slammed the door shut, started the engine, and drove. She didn't care where she was going, just that she was leaving. Leaving that house. Leaving everything behind. And even as she sped down the road, even as the town faded into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house, whatever had been waiting inside it, had never truly let her go. It had been watching her, waiting for her return, and now it would never let her forget.